In this video, we're going to take a look at the poetry of Anne Bradstreet and set up some of the themes that are discussed by two other poets of the 17th century, also named Anne, Anne Killigrew and Anne Finch. Now, as you learned in the literature of the 17th and 18th century essay in our textbook, women in these eras experienced a world that was rapidly changing in terms of politics, science, social status and expectations, and certainly still shifting in gender roles. In some ways, women took a few steps forward. Increase in education to some degree, depending upon your status, your class, certainly more women writing and more women reading. And yet, we take a few steps back. Jobs that were previously held by some women were becoming increasingly industrialized, and thus women were no longer able to work those jobs. More than ever, most women were expected to serve in the home unless you were lower class. Now, in theory, though, you can write from anywhere. So whether married or single, a woman could be an author when other professions were denied to them. You could keep the house, you could watch after your children, and you could still write. So we see a flourishing of women writers in the 17th and 18th centuries, though we'd be mistaken to think that things were suddenly easy. There were still many anonymous women writers protecting their identities out of fear of ridicule or blowback. What was appropriate for a woman to write was heavily scrutinized, and we'll see that in some of the writers we'll be reading this week and next week. At the same time, there was welcoming and support for women writers from other women and men too, and more of a sense of a community of writers as more people were publishing, people who knew each other and knew each other's work. This could be great for gaining a readership and publicity, but it also meant that your work would be compared to others more readily, and people could talk about it much more loudly. As such, we see a number of women writing about the precarious position of the female author, reflecting on what it was like to try to carve a name for yourself in the world of literature, full of its anxieties and its potential pitfalls. Anne Bradstreet was a Puritan writer living in the colony of Massachusetts. Although she embraced her domestic role as a mother of 8 children, she didn't want to be pigeonholed. She believed in and defended a woman's intellect. Bradstreet writes her poem The Prologue as a way to get out in front of any critiques of her writing, which lets us know how expected it was that a woman would come across resistance. A prologue comes at the start of a book, and so this is meant to be read before reading and judging her work. Many writers of any gender and time period fear criticism, but to be a woman writing in the 17th century meant opening yourself up to critique based on simply expectations of your gender. Although many of the women we're studying came from middle to upper class backgrounds with varying levels of education, the educations they received would not be the same as men, and so they must prove themselves on a number of levels. The poem must show impeccable talent and skill. It's like the saying about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Sure, he was great, but don't forget that Ginger Rogers did everything he did, backwards and in high heels. And thus, Anne Bradstreet needs to prove herself in this poem, and she starts with its form. The prologue follows a particular poetic form throughout. Each stanza is a sestet, that is, it's a stanza of 6 lines, and it follows a strict ABAB-CC rhyme scheme. Let's take a look. And I've marked out the rhyme scheme line by line. So we have an alternating rhyme. Kings and things, begun and run. And then at the very end of the stanza, we have what's called a rhyming couplet, when you have 2 lines right next to each other that have the same rhyme. So forth and worth. It's a little bit of a slant rhyme there. That's okay. But you see that it's AB, AB, CC. Kings begun, things run, forth, worth. And so she keeps that going throughout the poem. She maintains the form while also trying to communicate her message clearly. In the first 4 stanzas, the poem seems rather critical, self-effacing, and overly modest, assuring the reader that she's not going to try to do what men do because women aren't as naturally gifted as they are when it comes to writing. And something we might ask ourselves is whether or not this is something Bradstreet truly believes, or if it's an argument tactic, establishing a rapport with the reader before easing them into her writing so that some of the male readers who might doubt her will let their guards down and give her a chance. Something we can also observe as a literary tactic in Bradstreet's writing is that she fills this poem with allusions. An allusion is a literary device that is seen when an author references a person, event, or even another work of literature within their writing. Writers make allusions for a lot of different reasons. Like metaphors, they can often help us understand a concept better by linking it to something else that we know. It can also show the poet's knowledge about something, and in this poem and others we'll read this week, we'll see women loading their poetry with allusions to history and mythology, showing their awareness of a literary and cultural tradition into which they're entering. Might this be a way to prove their worth, to show that they've studied and know the great figures that have come before them? We see Bradstreet establishing here that she thinks herself inferior to the poets and historians who have come before, the people who have written about earth-shattering things like wars, captains, and kings. She alludes to the great Bartus, a writer of epic poetry, and says that she envies his skills with words, which the muses, that is, the Greek muses of mythology, said to inspire writers and artists, have not gifted her with. So we see her recognizing great writers and showing she's read them, and saying she's not claiming that she's like them. She refers to her own lines of poetry as obscure and simple. They don't threaten to dim the worth of historians and poets like Bartus. Notably, she says a Bartus can do what a Bartus will. She names him as a type, no longer just one person, but suggesting that he's in a long line of talented people, talented men, and she's not one of them. She's not part of that lineage. And yet, she doesn't say she has no skill, just that she'll write according to her own abilities, and no one should feel threatened by her doing so because it doesn't take away from their worth or their reputations. So even amidst this seeming modesty, Bradstreet's not entirely dissing herself. She's arguing that she has a right to write, and since the greats will remain, why should it be a problem for her to add her voice? We see this as a kind of argument that unfolds further in stanza 3, where she essentially compares herself to a schoolboy, saying that we wouldn't expect just a boy to be an expert at rhetoric, that is, the art of language and argument, nor would we expect great music to come from an instrument with broken strings. We wouldn't judge it for those things. And here she does seem to critique herself again, saying her muse, her inspiration, is foolish, broken, and blemished as a result of nature. Nature that has made her muse, her ability, unable to be repaired, suggested that she's been created as less than the Bartuses of the world. So does she mean this of herself personally or women generally? Is she playing into that expectation that women will be inferior to men? We do see multiple references to men in these stanzas. So Bartus was a man, she mentions a schoolboy, and then in the next stanza, she talks about a sweet-tongued Greek who lisped at first, but eventually found what he did seek, his voice. And so she's suggesting that where these men succeed, where the boy grows up and develops his talent, he becomes a Bartus, she cannot. She, in comparison, has a weak and wounded brain. Sounds pretty awful, and yet she still writes. We're reading her writing, and it's just the prologue. the start of many more poems. She doesn't give up. The question is, are these her actual thoughts about herself, or is she representing how she thinks she's supposed to feel as a woman writer? Because in stanza 5, Bradstreet addresses gender and gendered expectations rather head on. So let's take a look at this whole stanza. I am obnoxious to each carping tongue, who says my hand a needle better fits. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong, for such despite they cast on female wits. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance. Here her writing really starts to take on teeth. She says, I am obnoxious, but follows that with who she is obnoxious to, or rather who thinks she is obnoxious. She's not saying she believes that she is, which calls into question maybe the sincerity of the previous stanzas. Did she really think she was any of those inferior things? Because here she's targeting people who think she's obnoxious. Who think she's obnoxious? People with carping tongues. To carp means to complain. So people that are complaining potentially about her writing. People who think that she should sew instead of write poetry. That that's what she's fit for. And we'll see this idea of gendered expectations being challenged through women writers in other poems this week by our other Annes who address this idea as well. She says that these critics scorn female wit. That is, they don't believe women are capable of a way with words. And she predicts that if her poetry does turn out to be any good, it won't succeed. People will think that she didn't write it, or that it's just mere luck, not skill. This is a fear that a lot of women writers experienced, and it's one that came to life for Anne Killigrew, as you'll find out when you read her poem, upon saying that my verses were made by another, where she was accused of not writing her own work, apparently. So we see Bradstreet exploring here a theme that was very common to women writers. She's addressing her critics now, and she doesn't seem to agree with them after all, considering her strong word choices here. Now in the 6th stanza, she goes on to use more Greek allusions, so still harnessing that knowledge, and she's saying that compared to people nowadays, that the Greeks must not have thought women to be completely incapable of art, because, after all, the 9 muses of Greek art and literature were all women, and Calliope, the goddess of poetry and eloquence, was particularly praised. Now, Anne Killigrew, in her poem, also goes on to address Calliope in her work. Both Annes, as you'll see, draw connections between themselves as women and then historical female muses, the sources of classic literature. It's as though they're trying to establish a lineage or a heritage of women as figures of intellect, inspiration, and art, which they kind of need to invent, since we know from our study of medieval and Renaissance literature that there were very few identified women writing, and so they kind of have to write their own history and then try to create it by becoming, well, the kind of figures that we study today. Now, in the rest of the stanza, it does seem like Bradstreet is changing her tune and going back to the more critical view of herself. She suggests that the Greeks must have told a lie after all, that would soon untie or unravel, that women weren't goddesses of poetry after all. But Bradstreet is writing in a time period also referred to as the Neoclassical Age. And this is when ancient Greek and Roman literature and art and philosophy were highly studied and revered. That was a big part of a person's education. And so it would be kind of a weird move for her to say, oh, hey, those guys were wrong. So what might she be doing here? Maybe she's suggesting that if her male readers appreciate the Greeks, then they need to pay attention to the Greek association of women with poetry. And it's a kind of reverse psychology almost. You can either agree with me that the Greeks were wrong and women shouldn't have anything to do with art, or you can continue appreciating the Greeks as I know you do, and then you'll need to consider that there was a goddess of poetry. Now, Bradstreet doesn't come out and say this outright. That would be too bold. But it also means that she's very craftily putting together this poem that we need to work to unravel the truth of it. Now, the final two stanzas do seem to go back to that critical attitude again, that men excel over women, and her own words are unrefined in comparison. She argues that that's no reason not to let women write, however. They won't take away from men's reputations, and in fact, in these final lines, she says that it'll just make men look better in comparison. This mean, unrefined ore of mine will make your glycerine gold but more to shine. That's an interesting move to compare her poetry to rocks and the poetry of her readers, her assumed male readers, to be gold instead. So what do you think? Is Bradstreet genuine in her critiques of herself and then ostensibly her gender, or is this a rhetorical move meant to seem modest but actually prove her intelligence and skill with poetry? I'll leave that up to you. On the rest of this module page, you'll want to take a look at one more poem by Anne Bradstreet, and then a poem by Anne Finch, and a poem by Anne Killigrew. So we have a trio of Annes who are all writing poetry about what it's like to be a female writer, and to be judged, and to be anxious, and I think they all offer some really interesting insights into the condition of women writers in this time period. Now, these writers all wrote about other things too, and you'll find some of their other poems in our textbook if you want to check that out. So I don't want you to get the sense that, oh, all they wrote about was being afraid to write or being judged for writing. But I think it is important to look at these records to better understand what it was like to be a female writer in the 17th century here in particular. And then as you go through the module, you'll see that we will look at some writing that touches on different topics too.